I shudder to think, or how I thought I had all the answers. Of course, some might say that I act as if I still do, but at least from a different perspective. But more troubling is the pain that I may have caused to those around me. I remember when a good friend, another born-again Christian, told me he had gotten his girlfriend pregnant out of wedlock. I replied, "What were you thinking?" As if heaping on more shame was going to change the situation. And the irony of the whole situation, I thought I was proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ, and all the while placing a heavier burden on a heavy heart. As Christians, we have taken the good news of Jesus Christ, which is available to all persons, and have made into it a new law. Once again, lifting up some over others, putting God at a distance from those who do not embrace this law disguised as grace. We have distorted the words of Paul, which sought to remind the church in Rome that God is already accessible through grace. If you have ever ridden the subways in New York, you understand what it means to be a captive audience. Whether it's making a pulpit of the platform or a sanctuary of the subway car, these servants of God, these evangelists, take it upon themselves to remind you of the world's imminent demise. Apparently, there's nothing like fear to put the love of God into you. Sometimes, I wish I had the courage to stand up and sing. I wanted to let the words of amazing grace roll off my tongue, to let the words create a shelter from these prophets of death and destruction. Only once did I speak up. Of course, the woman was about 5'2", and since she was standing directly in front of me, I didn't have to speak loud to be heard. After listening to me say, "How is that love?" enough times, to repeated calls for repentance, the woman eventually took an empty seat and glared at me as if I was the devil incarnate. Unfortunately, this evangelical fervor is not limited to Christians. Over the last few years, I have discovered that Universalist Unitarianism, or is it Unitarian Universalism, is as diverse in opinions and characters as any other faith tradition. I was surprised to discover that there were Christian Unitarians and non-Christian Unitarians. Indeed, there are deistic Unitarians, believers in God, and non-deistic Unitarians, perhaps better described as ethical humanists. Needless to say, these believers and unbelievers can be as outspoken about their beliefs or unbelief as any Christian evangelist. A friend of mine discovered this when someone stood up in a service to complain about the hymn that included the word God. Now, friends, if you have any complaints about any of the hymns or the music, please speak to Russell. Right over there, but preferably after the service. Admittedly, it would be easy to dismiss these ardent believers, as well as the ardent non-believers, as dwelling on the margins of the faith community. In fact, it would be just as easy to say that they're crazy. Yet I wonder if they touch upon a deep nerve within the human consciousness, a fear or dis-ease that God is way out there, whether it's in the distant heavens or some kind of spiritual energy that still needs to be drawn in. After all, if God is in God's heavens, for all the world to be well, to be whole, to be reborn, God needs to be motivated, appeased, placated for the good of humanity. Or if God is some kind of life force, then we must shape and fashion ourselves in order to become a suitable vessel to channel that energy. The bottom line is that we are missing something. And very likely, we will never be good enough, shaped enough for God. hard to live into that message. The good news that God's grace is always present, already moving within us, already claiming us as acceptable to God. Yes, we make mistakes, and sometimes we are horribly corrupted. But God's grace still dwells at the very core of our being in the world. I am reminded of the work of Sister Helen Prégine, who spoke adamantly about ending the death penalty. For even in the basest moments of humanity, God is still accessible to us. God dwells upon our lips and within our hearts. It is not a matter of getting ready for God to come, but to recognize God has come. God's grace and forgiveness already abide within and among us. Now here's the tricky part. It is unlikely that we were intended to discover this grace on our own. Rather, we are called to testify to the movement of God's grace within us and within our community. We need to tell our stories. We need to share what our faith means to us. We need to share with our friends and neighbors what the chapel means to this community. Not as witnesses to the wrath to come, there's plenty of that. Not witnesses of the world going to hell in a handbasket, there's more than enough of that. But as witnesses to the goodness of God that is already in our midst. As Paul concluded this morning, how beautiful are the feet that bring good news. Oh, and by the way, perhaps one of you can tell me what it actually means to be going to hell in a handbasket.